Hi guys, welcome to Story Time with Jenn. Today we're going to be reading The Little Girl Who Did What? By Diane Dupuy. Illustrated by Ed Stockelback. Once upon a time, there was a very narrow village sandwiched between two tall, dark, very narrow mountains. Everyone who lived in the narrow village felt so safe living between the two tall, narrow mountains that they became very narrow-minded. The streets were very narrow, the houses were narrow, and all the schools and shops were narrow. The people were narrow, and the food they ate was narrow. Even the little mice who lived in their narrow houses ate narrow cheese. Why, even the hospital where all the children were born was narrow. Every morning, the narrow nurse would line up the new babies in a narrow row for everyone to admire. All of the babies looked the same, tucked in their narrow cribs in their narrow room, waiting to be taken home by their narrow parents. The nurse stopped to check on the newest baby who had just arrived, a little girl. Everything about this little girl in her narrow crib looked normal. That was until the nurse picked her up to give her a hug, and oops, the little girl farted a butterfly. The narrow nurse went running to the narrow doctor for help. She whispered in the doctor's narrow ear to tell him what had happened. The narrow doctor was so horrified that he screamed, "She did what?" The narrow doctor and the narrow nurse went running to catch the butterfly, but now there wasn't just one butterfly to catch, but 100 butterflies. The little girl couldn't stop herself. She kept on farting butterflies. The narrow doctor, who looked like a narrow weasel, went to tell the little girl's narrow parents the shocking news. When the narrow parents heard what had happened, they screamed, "She did what? What can we do?" The narrow doctor scratched his head. He had never met anyone like this little girl. There is no cure. "She is different," said the narrow doctor. "She will never be like the other narrow children because your little girl farts butterflies." Sadly, the narrow parents took the little girl home from the narrow hospital to live on their very narrow street. Putting her in her narrow crib, they looked at their cute little girl and said, "We love you just the same." Then they picked her up, gave her a big hug and kiss, and oops, the little girl farted 200 butterflies. The narrow parents ran all around the house chasing the butterflies, catching them and setting them free out the narrow window. The narrow parents worried every day about what would become of their little girl who was not like everyone else. They whispered to each other so no one would ever hear them say, "Our little girl farts butterflies." The narrow aunts and uncles came to visit the new little girl. The aunts smiled, picked her up, gave her a big hug, and oops, the little girl farted 300 butterflies. "She did what?" they screamed. The little girl kept farting butterflies. The aunts and uncles were horrified. They had never met anyone so different. They ran all around the house, catching the butterflies and setting them free out the narrow window. "Goodbye, we will not come back to visit," they said. The poor parents took the little girl to a narrow park to sit and think on a narrow bench. Then an old narrow lady came up to them and asked, "Why do you look so sad when you have such a beautiful little girl?" Before the narrow parents could say anything, the old narrow lady picked up the little girl, gave her a big hug, and oops, the little girl farted 400 butterflies. "She did what?" The narrow dogs barked and the cats meowed. One narrow cat even climbed up the narrow tree to catch a butterfly, but the branch broke and ouch! The cat fell flat on his narrow behind. The old narrow lady picked up the narrow cat and said, "Don't bring your daughter here again. She does not fit into our narrow park." As the little girl grew, the butterflies grew bigger and bigger. Her poor narrow parents became so tired of chasing butterflies around their narrow house. When it was time to go to the narrow school, the narrow mother whispered in the little girl's ear, "Please promise that you will not fart butterflies or everyone will know that you are different." The little girl promised her narrow mother that she would behave herself and not fart one butterfly. Then the little girl sat at her narrow desk. Nobody in the narrow classroom smiled. They all looked so bored reading their narrow books while the narrow teacher was busy writing on the narrow blackboard. When the little girl went out to play in the playground, she remembered her mother's whisper, "Please don't fart butterflies," and she didn't. But then a little boy looked at the little girl and smiled. He picked a flower and gave it to her with a hug and said, "I love you." The little girl blushed and oops, the little girl farted the biggest butterfly in the world. "She did what?" the children screamed. The narrow teacher and all the narrow children ran around the narrow playground trying to catch the butterfly. When the narrow teacher reached up to grab the big butterfly, she fell and landed head first into the narrow sandbox. All the narrow children laughed at the narrow teacher. The more they laughed, the more butterflies the little girl farted until the whole narrow playground was full of butterflies. The narrow police came in their narrow police cars to help catch the butterflies. Then the narrow firefighters came in their narrow fire engines to see what had happened. "She did what?" they all screamed. Suddenly, the big butterfly swooped down, lifted the little girl, and started to fly high in the sky. Everyone watched as they flew up to the dark, narrow mountains where their points were poking through the clouds. The narrow mother and father, who were afraid for their little girl, went running after the butterfly, followed by the little girl's narrow aunts, uncles, doctors, nurses, cats, and dogs, and even the old narrow lady from the park. Then, something very magical happened. The little butterflies flew up and pushed the dark mountains away so there was lots of room to paint the sky with their bright colors. Then the big butterfly lifted the little girl high up in the sky to write the word love against the sunset. The whole town was surprised at what this gifted little girl could do. Now that the tall, narrow mountains were gone, no one could believe how much room they had and how wonderful it felt to be nice and open. Then the little girl blew a kiss to the little boy. He was so happy that he hugged the old narrow lady from the park, and oops, they each farted a butterfly. When everyone saw what had happened, they all started to hug each other. The mother and father farted gold butterflies. The old lady from the park farted a silver butterfly. The children in the school farted butterflies that looked like rainbows. The firefighters farted red butterflies. The police officers farted dark blue butterflies. Even the little mouse farted. His butterflies were polka dot and looked like Swiss cheese. Everyone was so happy to be loved that they all became nice and wide. So whenever you see someone who is different from you, don't be afraid to move out of your narrow house and give them a big hug. Together, with your heart, you'll fart enough butterflies to create the biggest, the brightest, and the most beautiful sunset in the sky, colored with love. The end. That's the end of today's episode of Storytime with Jen. Tune in tomorrow. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos daily.